I knew something was weird the minute my electric bill doubled in a month. I'm not talking about a few extra bucks, I mean doubled. And I live alone. No kids, no hot tub, no crypto mining rig in the basement. Just me, my rescue mutt, and my peace and quiet until Victoria Whitmore, head of the HOA and Tesla evangelist, decided I owed her free charging. "Douglas," she said one morning as I was trimming my hedges, her voice as nasal as a leaf blower at dawn, "you really ought to do something about the color of your mailbox. It's not quite up to community standards." I glanced at her, then at my mailbox, which was the same dull beige as everyone else's. "It's identical to yours," I said. She ignored me and walked off, her clipboard under one arm, her sunglasses catching the morning sun like some kind of HOA Terminator. That should have been the end of it, but no. That was just her cover story. I'd soon find out that mailbox nonsense was just a distraction. It wasn't until 2 weeks later, when I was digging around behind my garage to fix a drainage pipe, that I saw it. A thick orange extension cord snaking under my fence line. It went under my siding, through my outdoor outlet and straight into Victoria's backyard. I stood there blinking like an idiot. No way. But yeah, there it was. She was siphoning off my power, probably to juice up that smug electric monstrosity she drove like it was a spaceship. I followed the cord, peeked over the fence, and sure enough her Tesla Model X sat in the driveway, plugged in, humming like a content cat. "Oh nope," I muttered, storming back inside. I wanted to confront her right then, but I knew better than to yell at an HOA president without backup. I needed proof. I installed a cheap security camera pointing at the outlet. Took less than an hour. That night she plugged in again. Next night too. Every night for a week. I printed the footage, highlighted the timestamps, and showed up at the next HOA meeting with a folder full of receipts. "Victoria," I said, standing up during community concerns, "you've been plugging your Tesla into my outdoor outlet." She laughed like I'd just accused her of stealing the moon. "Douglas, you must be confused. Maybe your electrician installed your outlet on the wrong side of the fence." "It's under my siding," I said, "and I have video." That shut her up for a second. The board whispered among themselves, but Victoria raised her hand like she was in charge of a courtroom. "We'll look into it," she said, fake smiling like she hadn't just been caught stealing, but I knew how these people worked. Looking into it meant ignoring it until you forget. So I decided to make her remember. The night after the HOA meeting, I walked the dog a little slower than usual. The neighborhood was unusually quiet, like it knew something had shifted. I passed Victoria's house and noticed the Tesla wasn't in the driveway anymore. Either she got spooked or she finally realized I wasn't bluffing. Either way, I wasn't done. She'd been draining my power for weeks, maybe longer. That wasn't just petty theft, it was calculated. I didn't need an apology, I needed accountability. And if the HOA board wanted to sweep it under the rug, I'd make it impossible. I spent the next day calling around. First, the city utility office. I asked if they could give me a breakdown of my energy usage by outlet. They couldn't, but the technician I spoke with was curious enough to ask why. When I explained, he paused. "You should probably talk to code enforcement," he said. "If someone's rerouting residential power like that, it could be a safety issue and a fire hazard." By evening, I had a visit scheduled with a city inspector. I didn't tell Victoria. I wanted her to keep plugging in just a little longer. While waiting for the appointment, I made a few adjustments to the outlet. Nothing dangerous, just a little deterrent. I built a decoy cover around it wired with a harmless but very loud piezoelectric siren. If she tried to plug in again, the second she lifted the cover, it would scream like a fire truck in a wind tunnel. It didn't take long. 3 nights later, I heard it. A sharp, shrill wail tore through the stillness just after midnight. I looked through the camera feed and there she was frozen, one hand still gripping the plug, her eyes wide like she'd been caught breaking into a bank vault. She bolted. The cord snapped free and whipped around like a severed snake. I didn't laugh. I just saved the footage, dated it, and filed it with the rest. The next morning, I found a citation on my porch violation. Unauthorized alarm system creating a nuisance, signed. Victoria Whitmore, HOA president. I stared at the paper, my jaw tightening. My camera caught her trespassing and stealing power, and her response was to fine me for protecting my own property. That was the moment I knew she wasn't just shady, she was dangerous. She wasn't abusing the HOA for control. She was using it as a shield. I sent everything to the city inspector before he arrived the next day. When he showed up, I walked him around back, showed him the cable route, the outlet, the camera setup, and the siren box. He nodded the whole time. "I've seen this before," he said. "Usually it's duplexes or renters trying to dodge the meter. But this, she's in elected office in your HOA?" "Yeah," I said. "And she's using it to shut down anyone who calls her out." He took photos, measurements, and noted the tampering on the outlet. Then he pulled out a form and asked me to sign a formal complaint. I didn't hesitate. 3 days later, I got a call from a detective. "Mr. Brandt, this is Detective Alonzo from the Property Crimes Unit. We're following up on a report from City Code Enforcement. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" He came by that afternoon. This time I laid everything out. The inflated bills, the footage, the extension cord, the HOA fine, even the ridiculous comment about my mailbox. "She's retaliated since you confronted her?" he asked. "She fined me the morning after I caught her on camera. I've got the time-stamped footage if you want to see." He did. He watched it all, his face unreadable. When it was over, he nodded slowly. "That's felony theft of services, Mr. Brandt," he said. "And possibly wire tampering depending on how she accessed your outlet. We'll need a warrant to check her property, but this is more than enough to open a case." By the end of the week, Victoria's home was the talk of the neighborhood. A police cruiser parked out front for most of the afternoon. I stayed inside, blinds drawn, watching from the corner of my window. When the 2 officers came out, they were carrying the orange extension cord in a clear evidence bag. That same night, her Tesla was back in the driveway. I noticed something strange about it. It was still plugged in. But this time, not to my house, to itself. The cord was looped back into her garage, plugged into a wall outlet she'd clearly rigged to replace her stolen supply. Probably thought she could charge it on her own again, but she'd gotten used to my amperage. Hers wasn't rated that high. At 3 in the morning, a muffled pop echoed through the neighborhood. I stepped outside casually just to see. Smoke was curling out from under her garage door, and a faint chemical smell hung in the air, burned lithium. The Tesla's battery had overloaded and shorted. The fire department arrived minutes later, but the damage was done. The vehicle wasn't in flames, but that battery pack, dead, fried, useless. The next morning, she was on the front lawn arguing with 2 fire inspectors and her insurance adjuster. Her arms flailed, her voice cracked. "I didn't catch every word, but I heard enough. Not my fault. The power grid's been inconsistent." When she saw me watching from my porch, she pointed. "That man, he sabotaged me." The inspector turned, looked at me, then back at her. "Ma'am," he said, "your outlet was improperly modified. You're lucky this didn't torch the entire garage." Later that afternoon, I received a letter hand-delivered by a young man from the HOA board. He looked sheepish, mumbled something about reassessing leadership, and handed me the envelope. Inside was an apology signed by 4 of the 5 board members. Victoria had been suspended pending investigation. The fine she issued me, voided, and the best part? A formal vote would be held at the next board meeting to remove her entirely. I didn't say anything. Just nodded and closed the door. That evening, I watched the sunset from my porch with a cold drink and my dog curled at my feet. The house was quiet. The power meter ticked along at its usual pace. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't living in someone else's game. Victoria's Tesla sat immobile in her driveway, a silent monument to arrogance and entitlement. The HOA board tried to spin the situation as an unfortunate misunderstanding, but the neighborhood wasn't buying it. Half the residents stopped waving at her. The other half started waving at me. She tried to steal power. She ended up losing hers. 2 days after the fire inspectors left, the neighborhood buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest. Lawn chairs appeared on porches that hadn't seen use in years. People watered non-existent plants just to keep an eye on Victoria's house. And for once, no one was whispering behind closed doors. They wanted answers and they wanted them out loud. I wasn't planning to do anything else. I figured the suspension, the investigation, the dead Tesla battery, all of it was enough. But then a soft knock came at my door just after dinner time. I opened it to find Carol Gibbons from 3 houses down, holding a stack of envelopes and looking more anxious than usual. She didn't waste time. "Douglas, I think you need to see this." She handed me one of the envelopes. Inside was a quarterly HOA dues notice, but something was off. The amount due was nearly triple what it had been the last billing cycle. And at the bottom, in small print, was a line item labeled Emergency Infrastructure Surcharge. I looked up. "They charged everyone for the fire," she said. "They're saying it was a community-wide safety risk and we all have to cover the costs." I blinked. "They're billing us for her garage meltdown," she nodded. "A few of us called the board. They claim it's already been voted on, but no one remembers a vote. No notice, no agenda item, nothing." I stepped aside and let her in. She wasn't the only neighbor with questions. Within the hour, 6 others showed up, each with the same envelope. All of them had been hit with that mysterious surcharge. One guy, Todd from the cul-de-sac, had already paid it out of fear they'd lien his home. But the rest of us weren't having it. I booted up my laptop and pulled up the HOA's bylaws from their own website. "Any new fees must be proposed in writing, listed on a public agenda, and passed with a 2/3 vote during a scheduled meeting," I read aloud. "Which means they can't just make this stuff up," Carol finished. "Exactly. We cross-checked the last 3 meeting agendas. Nothing. No mention of a new fee, no emergency vote, no record of a decision." What we did find, however, was more telling. The board meeting minutes from 2 months ago included a note. President Whitmore moved to create discretionary emergency fund access via executive authorization. Motion passed by simple majority. It hadn't been highlighted. It was buried deep in the bullet points under miscellaneous. I called the HOA's management company the next morning, posing as a concerned homeowner trying to understand my invoice. "I was told this surcharge was from an emergency vote," I asked. The woman on the line hesitated. "That's what we were told. Our office received the directive after the board president submitted a fire incident report." "And who submitted that report?" "Victoria Whitmore, acting in her capacity as president. But she's suspended." Another pause. "I'm sorry, sir. That's not reflected in our records." That's when it clicked. She never informed the management company of her suspension. She was acting like nothing had changed and still issuing directives. I called Detective Alonzo again. "She's issuing financial orders while under investigation," I said. "And misrepresenting her status to an administrative authority." He didn't need convincing. "Keep the invoice," he said. "We're adding fraud and abuse of office to the charges. And if she's been accessing HOA funds under false pretenses, that's embezzlement." That night, the detective met with me and 3 other neighbors who'd received the same surcharge. I handed over printed copies of the invoices, the bylaws, and the meeting minutes. Carol provided a recording of her call with the board, where they admitted no one remembered voting on the surcharge. Alonzo's brow furrowed deeper with every piece of paper. "She's not just overstepping her authority," he said. "She's laundering personal liability through the HOA." 2 days later, a subpoena was issued for the HOA's financial records. The board treasurer, Dennis, ended up calling me nervous, out of breath, and suddenly very interested in being helpful. "I didn't know she was still submitting directives," he said. "She told us the surcharge was already approved. I didn't even sign off on it." "Then why didn't you say anything at the last meeting?" "She threatened to have me removed for negligence," he replied. Said she'd claim I failed to disclose a conflict of interest with one of the landscape vendors. Did you? No, he practically shouted. I just wanted to keep my head down. It wasn't just about power anymore. Victoria had built an entire system around fear and manipulation, using her position to coerce silence and rewrite the rules mid-game. When the city auditor's office got involved, things escalated fast. Turns out, she'd been siphoning more than electricity. Over the past year, she'd funneled nearly $12,000 from the HOA's general fund into a vehicle operations and sustainability line item, an expense category she created herself. It gets worse. She submitted 3 fake invoices from a company called Green Motion Solutions for community transportation infrastructure. The address on the invoice? A P.O. box registered under her cousin's name. The checks deposited into an account that, according to the bank's fraud department, had only one authorized user, Victoria Whitmore. She wasn't just stealing power, she was stealing money. The police didn't wait for the next board meeting. They arrested her on a Thursday afternoon, right as she was walking to her mailbox. 2 unmarked sedans pulled up and officers stepped out with a warrant in one hand and a pair of cuffs in the other. I watched from a distance. No triumph, no celebration. Just quiet satisfaction as justice caught up with someone who'd treated the neighborhood like her own personal fiefdom. The charges included theft of services, fraud, embezzlement, wire tampering, and obstruction of a civil investigation. Bail was denied due to the ongoing risk of financial tampering. With Victoria gone, the HOA board scrambled to distance themselves. Dennis resigned. 2 others followed. A special election was held within 3 weeks. Carol ran for president. She won unanimously. At the first meeting under her leadership, she stood at the front of the room and held up a thick folder. These are the reforms we'll be implementing: transparent accounting, public agendas, no executive decisions without membership input. And every homeowner will receive a quarterly report of all financial activity. People clapped. Not a golf clap. Real applause. As for me, I didn't run for anything. I didn't want power. I just wanted peace. But that didn't stop Carol from handing me a small gift bag after the meeting. Inside was a miniature Tesla. On the bottom, she'd written in Sharpie, "No outlet required." I laughed for the first time in a while. Victoria thought she could take whatever she wanted and hide behind bylaws and fine print. But she forgot the one thing people like her always forget. Some neighbors read the fine print too, and some of us install cameras, and some of us know exactly where the circuit ends. She flicked the switch and the whole thing lit up, and then she got burned. The first board meeting under Carol's leadership had barely ended when I noticed a man in a gray wool coat loitering near the community bulletin board. He wasn't from the neighborhood. I'd lived there long enough to know every face within a 2-block radius. He stood out, not just because of the tailored coat in early spring, but because he was scribbling notes while staring at the laminated HOA charter tacked to the wall like it held state secrets. When I approached, he turned and nodded once. "Douglas Brandt?" he asked. "Depends who's asking." He extended a leather badge holder. "Assistant District Attorney Marcus Feller. I'm overseeing the Financial Crimes Task Force handling the Whitmore case." I stepped back. "Didn't think it'd go that far." "It went further than you know," he said, pulling a folded document from his inner pocket. "We have probable cause to believe the fraudulent invoices weren't isolated to Green Motion Solutions." I read the paper. It listed 4 additional vendors that had submitted payments to the HOA over the past year. All had P.O. boxes, no verified business licenses, and the same routing number, a detail that hadn't been publicly disclosed. "Looks like she was building herself a treasury," I muttered. He nodded. "We believe she intended to liquidate and relocate. She purchased a property in Nevada under a trust name last month, quietly, cash. That hit harder than expected. Victoria hadn't just been shady, she was preparing an escape plan." "Why tell me this?" I asked. He glanced at the community center behind us, where a few neighbors were still chatting and stacking chairs. "Because you're the reason we caught it when we did. If she'd left 2 weeks earlier, this entire HOA would have been liable for her theft. The board's insurance would have denied the claim due to internal fraud, and homeowners would have been assessed for the loss individually." I felt my stomach turn. That surcharge wasn't just a cash grab, it was her exit fund. Exactly. He handed me a second document. "That's a sworn statement form. We'd like you to submit your full account as part of the evidentiary file." Victoria's attorney is already trying to frame this as a misunderstanding between neighbors. She used a cord to siphon my power, installed it under my siding, and fined me when I caught her. We know. But juries like clean narratives. "Your testimony could help us lock this down before she spins the story." I signed it the next morning and scanned the form to his office. I thought that would be my last involvement. But 2 days later, I was summoned to testify before the county grand jury. I wore my best suit, the one I hadn't touched since my niece's wedding. The courthouse was colder than I expected, all polished granite and distant murmurs. When I was called in, the room was quiet. 12 jurors sat along a curved bench, their faces unreadable. The ADA stood beside a projection screen. He started with the footage, the security clips, the timestamps, then moved to the utility reports showing the surge in usage. Next came the forged invoices, the bank routing data, and finally, the real kicker, the tape of Victoria on the phone with the management company, insisting she was still president and threatening to dissolve the board if they didn't process the surcharge. I answered their questions simply. I didn't embellish or speculate, just the facts. The moment the siren went off, the retaliation fine, the board's inaction, the fire, the surcharge, the fake companies, the arrest, when I stepped out, the ADA was waiting. "They're deliberating," he said. "But I don't think it'll take long." It didn't. By the following week, the grand jury handed down a 6-count indictment, 2 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of embezzlement, 1 count of falsifying corporate documents, and 2 counts of criminal impersonation of a public official. Victoria entered a plea of not guilty. Her attorney tried to argue that she'd been acting in the HOA's best interest, managing emergency funds during a crisis. But the prosecution dismantled that narrative with the bank records, the false invoices, and the witness testimony from her own board members. The trial lasted 4 days. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 6 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for the first 3. Restitution was ordered in the full amount of the stolen funds, plus damages to the management company and individual homeowners who'd already paid the surcharge. The state seized the Nevada property. Turns out it was purchased under a trust that she controlled, directly a rookie mistake for someone trying to hide assets. After the sentencing, Carol invited me to a community potluck. I wasn't one for gatherings, but it felt different now. People smiled more genuinely. No clipboards, no citations. Just neighbors, talking and laughing like they hadn't in years. I chatted with Todd, the guy who'd paid the surcharge early. He'd been reimbursed through the restitution fund and was now helping Carol overhaul the HOA's accounting practices. Carol mentioned they were bringing in a third-party auditor and posting financials to a private resident portal every quarter. "Transparency is contagious," she said, offering me a plate of lemon bars. I took one, mostly because I didn't want to be rude. It wasn't half bad. Later that evening, I walked home under a quiet sky. My dog waited by the door, tail wagging slow and steady. The house was calm. The power meter blinked its soft, steady rhythm, no spikes, no surges, just peace. I stepped into the backyard, flashlight in hand. The orange extension cord had been taken as evidence months ago, but sometimes I still checked the outlet. Old habits. I opened the cover, still sealed, still mine. As I turned to head back inside, I caught a glimpse of something new on the fence. A laminated sign, bolted in clean font. Private property, no trespassing, camera monitored. It wasn't mine. Carol must have put it up, just in case someone else got ideas. I didn't need to fight anymore. The neighborhood had found its spine. The bylaws were being rewritten. The board was being rebuilt. And the HOA, the very thing she tried to weaponize, was finally being used to protect the community, not control it. Victoria burned her bridges, fried her own battery, and tried to wire the fallout to the rest of us. But when you play with power, you better know where the current flows. She didn't. We did.